Moving on to the other kinds of insects that you might see chewing on leaves and needles are a group of strange wasps known as sawflies. These are the members of the order Hymenoptera that are plant feeders, and there are a couple of different kinds of sawflies, as we'll get to, but the appearance of the larvae is very similar to that of a caterpillar, which we've just discussed, something that's going to turn into a moth or butterfly. These instead are going to turn into small, non-stinging, heavy-bodied wasps. And the way you can tell them apart are going to those prolegs, those appendages that are on the abdomen of a caterpillar. They're also on the abdomen of a sawfly. There are differences, though, in the number and the appearance of these prolegs. In a caterpillar, something will turn into a moth or butterfly. You're going to have 2 to 5 pairs, and each of those is going to be tipped with a set of hooks, those crochets. Unlike the caterpillars, the sawflies are going to have prolegs, but they number more than 5, 6 to 8 pair, and you will not have any little hooks. And again, these are not true legs, although they function leg-like when they're young. When this becomes the adult wasp, there will be no evidence of a proleg on the adult insect. So, sawflies can be broken into 2 main families. There's one that are primarily found in conifers, and the other on a wide host of usually deciduous plants. So the conifer sawflies, the order Diprionidae, can be found on most any kind of conifer. Here we see them mostly on pines, but there's some on junipers and some on Douglas fir. And the adult stage is a heavy-bodied, non-stinging wasp, as are all of these. And in the conifer sawflies, you can see real sexual dimorphism, where the males will be smaller, but they'll also have extremely large antennae. And when you see extremely large antennae on a male insect, that probably indicates that this is one that produces a pheromone, a potent pheromone. And that is the case with these sawflies. The female produces a pheromone that is perceived by the male and picked up on receptors that are located on those large antennae. Sawflies will insert their eggs into plant tissues. Since we're talking about conifer sawflies, they'll insert them into the needles with a ovipositor, that egg-laying organ at the tip of the abdomen, that can literally saw into the foliage. And in the picture in the lower right, we see some little light areas on those needles, and those are areas where sawfly eggs have been inserted. Now, the eggs of most conifer sawflies hatch very early in season, before bud break. The adults are out laying these eggs usually in spring before bud break, and then the larvae come out. So we see some young stage sawflies in both of these pictures that have just emerged, and they're starting to feed, and as they feed, they'll consume more and more of the foliage. There is, as a little side note, one odd sawfly in this group, in this part of the world, called the bull pine sawfly, generally associated with ponderosa pine. And this is actually one that will feed in the larval stage throughout the winter. You might find this active in December, but they mature in early spring. Normally, the adult stage will emerge and lay eggs in spring, and they'll overwinter in the soil, as I'll show you in just a bit. So here we see very young stage sawflies, just after they've emerged, and they're starting to feed, and they may leave the center vein of the needles. They often will feed gregariously in groups, so you might have a mass of these together, and furthermore they may have some defensive behaviors, so they may all twitch, and some of them may rear back and regurgitate distasteful fluid, and these are all ways to try to defend themselves against other animals that may try to feed on them, notably birds. Anyway, since the activity of all this happens early, before bud break, typically the kind of symptom you're going to see on a plant that has been affected by sawflies is that the older growth will be gone, and then the new growth comes out just fine. These aren't feeding on the new growth, unlike the Douglas fir tussock moth, for example. You might see, and this is better illustrated on the left, I think, a picture on the left, some of the needles that have been denuded of all the green tissue, but the center vein is left, and so we're seeing these little curls. That's all the left of the needles. So older growth gets finished off, and this all is happening very early in the season before the new growth even comes out. So in an area that were to have a experience an outbreak of conifer sawflies, the appearance of the plants may be tufted, and this shows a set of trees that were defoliated in a 2-year event, which is rare. Most often these have a 1-year eruption and then resolve themselves. Many natural enemies affect sawflies in natural systems here in this part of the world. Outbreaks are rarely persisting more than a year. When they're full grown, when they finish feeding, the sawflies will drop or usually crawl to the base of the plant, go into the leaf litter, the needles and the like, spin a little cocoon and remain dormant within that cocoon. Typically they don't actually pupate until the next year, so winter is spent as a full-grown larva within a cocoon somewhere in the leaf litter around the base of a plant. 1 generation a year, that's the norm for sawflies. Now the common sawflies, that's the name for the other family of sawflies, may be found on a wide variety of plants, and these are the ones you'll see on deciduous plants. So indicated here are 4 species that are fairly common in one part of the country or another. Currant sawfly or dogwood sawflies, actually 2 species. Columbine sawflies, mountain ash sawfly, something that's quite abundant in areas to the east of here, but not so common or even not existing in much of the western U.S. So the common sawflies develop on deciduous plants. Again, some more. We're seeing one on willow. We're seeing one on raspberry. One on aspen. One on columbine yet again. And as an example, the currant sawfly will show some of the features that you often see with the sawflies that are feeding on trees and shrubs that are deciduous, the common sawflies. So these are insects that will be surviving the winter in a cocoon at the base of the plant, transforming into the adult sometime in early spring, shortly after bud break, and then you'll see the adults coming out. The males are a little smaller than the females. They don't have the highly tufted antennae of the males of the conifer sawflies. They will mate very early in the season again, usually shortly after bud break, and then the females will go about their business of laying eggs. And common sawflies insert their eggs into leaf tissues, usually in the midrib. So with this currant sawfly example, we're seeing a row of eggs on the right that were laid in the midrib of a currant leaf. The eggs hatch, and you'll get the young stages emerging from that. So we see some fragments of old hatched eggs here, very young larvae, and the pattern of many of these is the very early stage larvae subsequently feed on the interior of the leaf, creating a shot hole type of pattern of defoliation. So little tiny holes in the interior. So shot hole feeding is one indication of common sawflies on many plants. Now there's not too many things that make shot holes. Flea beetles and that European elm flea weevil, but the common sawflies are another one. And they'll just do it in the early stage, so that the very first feeding will produce these small interior holes in the leaf that are quite small, what we'd call a shot hole. But as they grow, the holes get progressively bigger, and then they become a more generalized feeder. So they're not going to confine themselves to the leaf interior. Older larvae will feed along the leaf edge for the most part and consume tissue generally, sometimes even taking out some of the larger veins. In the picture in the lower right, you can see 2 currant sawflies chewing on the last bit of leaf tissue that I had on my currant shrub several years ago. So generalist feeders in the end stages, but shot hole is usually an early stage symptom that you should be aware of to give you a heads up that something's happening. So generalized defoliation following the original event. And again, see several kinds of generalized defoliation pattern here from both common sawflies, and in the lower left a conifer sawfly. One more example, an insect that for a while was quite important regionally, called the brown-headed ash sawfly, associated with ash, particularly green ash. Again, as just another example of the typical kinds of habits we're going to see with one of these common sawflies. The adults emerge shortly after bud break, so they're going to be associated with the young leaves as they come out. And again, the females will insert their eggs with their ovipositor, their saw-like ovipositor, insert the eggs into the leaf tissue. And in the picture in the upper left here, you can see, I hope, they kind of look like little bubbles along the edge of that ash leaf, and those are the eggs that had been laid by the sawfly. And in the lower right, there's a close-up of these eggs that have been inserted into the leaf tissue. The eggs hatch, you have the first stage larvae emerging, and once again, the original symptom you'll see will be a shot hole. So they'll be feeding, making tiny little holes in the interior of the leaf. But again, as they get older, they will have a more generalized type of feeding that does not restrict themselves to the leaf interior, and usually is concentrated along the leaf edge, consuming sometimes even the larger veins. Peak defoliation typically occurs suddenly, but persists for only about a week. These are usually very rapid in terms of their development, so oftentimes by the time you notice that there's some defoliation event going on, you're pretty much behind the curve and it's just about to end on its own. Very, very quick appearance of the injury, and then it rapidly subsides. Ash sawflies then usually crawl down the trunk. Most drop from the leaves as well. Some of them will drop from the leaves as well, and then they burrow into the soil, make a little cell, pupate within that cell the following year. In this case, quite a large number of them around the base of a ash tree. This is a phenomenon we saw very early on when this insect came into the state, where we had massive amounts of defoliation as they moved into new areas along the Front Range of Colorado. But what happened was that after about 4 or 5 years, natural enemies started to catch up with the this newly introduced insect, and the brown-headed ash sawfly, which once was a dominant topic of discussion and did serious damage to ash trees for a considerable period, is now a minor species. Natural enemies resolved it. Finishing up on the subject of sawflies is an unusual group of sawflies. Needs don't quite fit some of the other things we talk about. They are in the family of common sawflies, but their appearance is quite a bit different. These are the slug sawflies, and they get their name because they tend to be kind of shiny, often kind of like a slug, and they feed on the surface of the leaf, producing a very distinctive kind of skeletonizing damage. So this is a very different kind of damage we'll see than occurs with the other kinds of sawflies. The pear slug and rose slug are the most common ones around here. Elsewhere there are slug sawflies that occur on oak as well. So slug sawflies are an unusual type of sawfly that produce skeletonizing injuries. Some of them do it on the upper surface of the leaf, others on the lower surface of the leaf. So skeletonizing is a kind of injury we haven't seen much yet so far, but we'll talk about it in a little bit when we get to Japanese beetle and leaf beetles. Skeletonizing, once again, is an injury pattern where the insects will feed between the larger veins, leave the larger veins intact, and leave the opposite surface intact as well on which they're feeding. So if they're feeding on the underside, the upper side of the leaf will be intact, and vice versa if they're feeding on the lower. If they're feeding on the upper side. So the pear slug, or pear sawfly, is probably the one that you're going to find most easily around here. It feeds on a wide variety of plants that are commonly grown: sweet cherry, cotoneaster, hawthorn, common pear, being some of the more common hosts for this insect. They will probably not be observed in the adult stage. Again, sawfly adults are small, heavy-bodied, non-stinging kinds of wasps and don't attract much attention. The adults will insert eggs into leaves. In the picture on the right, we can see an area where there's an old egg scar. And the larva that is also in that picture on the right has hatched from that egg and originally makes a series of little small pits. But as they get older, the areas on which they feed are more broadly affected, and they're going to be producing a general skeletonizing kind of injury. So older larvae feed as skeletonizers, leaving the main veins, making it very lacy in appearance. This is an insect with 2 generations, so we'll see one event of defoliation often occurring in very early summer and another in late summer, perhaps into September. Skeletonizing with select sawflies is often on the upper leaf surface, and there are no other insects that would skeletonize on the upper leaf surface. That is an unusual habit because that obviously makes them quite visible to potential predators, but some slug sawflies will do this. Others will feed on the lower surface. But skeletonizing, again, not a common kind of